I moved here in 1978, so it was either 78 or 79. I lived over in Gateshead. I lived there. I was newly married and I had one daughter, and I moved over here. And I think for me the immediate thing was the isolation, that I didn't have any family over this side of the river. They were on the other side of the river, so I felt quite isolated, plus being a first time mum. And I first met Liz as one of my neighbours, and Liz had told me about the playgroup. So I went along there, and you invited me to be a parent helper at the playgroup. So I did that, and that was actually how I first became involved in anything basically outside of the home. And then I was told about the community project here, so I came along and I met Katrina McCormick and Joe Caffrey, who were the community development workers. And Katrina just started a women's group, and so that I started to go to the women's group, and that met every Wednesday, once a fortnight. And that was I always say that was the first time that I was me and not somebody's mother or auntie or sister. And it was an amazing group. It was in effect an informal support group. So that was my first contact with the community project.
I moved into Scotswood in about 1972, but I didn't become involved in any community projects or anything until the 80s, I would say, the early 80s, when I first became involved. And it was actually Jackie who got me involved in the Scotswood Neighbourhood Centre. I was working along at the playgroup at Scotswood Library, and a number of the women had issues around about debt and loan sharks. And because Jackie was on the management committee here, she was aware that that the community worker here was interested in developing a credit union.
We started, it was, as Liz said, it was about there was a lot of debt in the area, but also people trying to survive on low wages or on benefits, and people are being preyed on by loan sharks. And so what they would do would be they would take people's family allowance books off them, and you'd say the loan sharks outside the post office on a Monday give women the family allowance books. The women would go in, get the money, and then come back to the car and give the loan shark the book and the money. And what they would do, they put a cross in the book to say that's when you've paid off. The things that people used to get the money for would be, the loans for, would be things like clothes, things for school, shoes, bills. And of course the loan sharks charged huge amounts of interest. And there was also the threat that things would happen if you didn't pay the money. So that's why we set up a savings club to start off with, where those of us who were in the community project put a little bit of money away and we put it in the post office and kept a savings group going. And we used that as the basis for the credit union. We had training from people from Skelmersdale, so it was an affiliated credit union. And the key thing there was if you borrowed £100, your first week's interest was 23p, which was a massive difference. And the only criteria were that you lived in the area and that you continued to save, and so you built up your savings. And basically we set off the credit union movement in the northeast.
We did, yes. And because there wasn't a credit union between Manchester and Strathclyde, it was really a new thing here, and we had to work very hard to convince people that we in Scotswood could be trusted with other people's money. But building credibility with the local authority and with sort of people in the community, to trust their friends and neighbours to look after their money. But it was such to be cliched about it, it was such an empowering thing, and so many people who got involved, first as members, but then as on the committee or as volunteers. So many of us went on to do a lot more, didn't we?
Well, that was the thing that, I wish there were more people here who could talk about their histories, because there were really, really strong women. The majority of people involved were women. And I think of, people like Linda and Margie and Sonia, people who did amazing work, set up childcare, cleaning cooperatives. They did such amazing work, and not only that, though, the campaigning work as well.
Oh yeah.
All the campaigning work we did.
It sort of felt as if once you are sort of in control of your finances, and that burden was off your back, you then were able to look at the wider issues. And I mean, you mentioned the childcare. I mean, we started the Creche for All campaign because the board of directors for the credit union, we had 19 children between us, didn't we?
There's certain tactics that you can use if you want to set up a creche, like if you have a number of children with flaky pastry, Greg's pasties, and go to the PAT meeting when there's councillors there and people and there's crumbs everywhere. They start to realise the value of having a creche. So there's ways and means to
I remember that meeting when it was Jeremy Beecham who was leader of the council at the time, and we had 2 sort of creche workers and 9 children. And we're in the committee room and they were under the table and one climbed on his lap and it was orange juice all over. And that's when they first gave mainline funding to this project for creche. But the other thing, as you said, about the creche workers getting training and becoming employed, they made a cooperative, and Rainbow Creche is still going now. In fact, some of the children that were in the creche are now workers in the creche. And the children became very politically aware, didn't they? Yeah. Remember the marches down to London in 85 where all the children were there.
That was what was so lovely about him, because the all the way from Maggie out onto 101 10% 101 it now. The amazing things we did, like when Fowler brought out the green paper on benefits reform. And it was the year after Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, no one have a return to Victorian values. So we set up a soup kitchen at the community project, and we made great big pans of homemade vegetable broth. And we went to the post office. We had some outside the community project and went outside the post office. And we offered people free soup, and then asked if they would like to sign a petition. And what we did at that point, we told them what the benefits changes were that were being proposed.
What's happened with a few campaigns, the creche, the Action for Benefit, they started off as Scotswood campaign, then became citywide, and with the campaign for benefits we linked up with a national campaign as well, because I can remember going to Liverpool.
Yeah, we linked it. It ended up being Tyneside Action for Benefits, and it linked in with the Child Poverty Action Group. And so we'd like to think that it did have some input into policy development alongside other pressure groups and charities. The campaigns that we did, we did have, I think, successes, and it gave people hope as well that it was still worth staying on the estate. But eventually, I think estates reach a tipping point, and unless they have that support, then they do go over that edge.
And that happened in the late 80s.
What we found was that long-term residents started to leave. So you had, there's always, I think in estates, there can be quite a quick turnover, and that churning effect. And sometimes people would move in and go within 3 to 6 months. But we saw the difference when long-term residents start to leave. So we found that the number of empty houses, the void houses, dramatically increased threefold at least. And it was in both the local authority houses and in the private sector houses. And the reasons people gave was crime, or fear of crime, or harassment. And that's one of the reasons we started off Scare, Stop Crime Against Residents. We were told that we were cowards and criminals who lived on the estate. What you're doing on this estate, you seem canny. What you're doing living in the swamp. And these were quotes from police officers. What we did was we, at one point, went along to the local police forum, and it was really interesting because the people who were there, a lot of went from the community project because we're concerned about about crime, but also the fear of crime, and about the high levels of this, the cars, and the sort of crimes that you get when an estate's been constantly run down and resources taken from an estate in terms of shops and leisure facilities and all of those sort of things that are like the social glue of a community. So all these issues were going on, and we went to the police forum, and I thought I must be living in a different world, because people were saying how fabulous the police were. They were just wonderful, and the police were saying, oh yes, and it was so cosy, and we sat there and went, excuse me. And then we talked about what had happened and what was happening. And at that point, one of the police officers, the senior police officer, said he would come and speak with us. Mm-hmm. And that was the, you know, to me, this is what's worrying me still about the politicians like Westminster, Whitehall. They continue to make policies and come out with statements, glib statements, when actually there are estates where people have been so active and against all the odds have done things, and have done things against the odds of the economic situation and the political situation. And yet still it's those people in those areas who are stigmatised. We did everything that we possibly could to try and change what was happening in our community, and where we were let down was by the government, at times by local government. Sometimes they were very supportive, but definitely by central government policies and by business.
Yeah, yes.
What's really key for me is, in terms of any kind of activism that we were involved with, now I say we because it was collective action with everyone who became involved, is there's a big distinction between community activism and service provision. And for me, that's what changed in the 80s and in the 90s. There's been a huge push to get, say, community, this community is stuck in front of everything. And actually it became meaningless. And what we talk about, what I talk about, and I talk about community activism, is about it's collective action where local people identify the concerns, prioritise them, decide what strategies they want to use to address them, and take collective action to obtain those objectives. One of the key issues about the community activism here was that it was about a process of politicisation, and it wasn't about affiliation to any particular party. It wasn't things like the big society, which is suggesting that people, you know, I just have to say, like David Cameron's talking about the big society. We're talking about stuff we did over 30 years ago, yes. And we did it in the face of opposition from you know, politicians, from officers within the council, and it was because of the idea that local people somehow wouldn't have the skills or the ability and couldn't be trusted to do things like the credit union. We proved them wrong, amazingly so. This idea of the big society, I think, is deeply offensive. I think it's suggesting that people didn't do anything before, and the whole thing's deeply flawed, and that's something I could go on about for a long time, but it is deeply flawed, and it's actually patronising, and it's deeply offensive, because David Cameron didn't come up with the idea of the big society. Miliband didn't create the good society. We were doing it. Women on their estates right across the country have been doing it for years and continue to do it.
Issues are important to them.
And that's the thing, yeah. Because it's about what we worked on. We identified issues locally, and then we collectivised the issues. What we didn't have was somebody being paid £20,000 to go and organise a tea dance or something like that. This is, to me, this idea of the big society is not about community activism. It's about, I think it's a screen for cuts, yeah. And trying to get people to do work for nothing. But you see, the thing is, why would Cameron want the kind of activism that we were involved with, that all of us are involved with? Who would want to have a group of really strong women saying, we will not be treated like this, we won't be treated with disrespect? These are the issues from our perspective. We used to say, because we live here 24 hours a day, here's what our needs and our concerns are. We worked out, all of us here, what we wanted to do, what our priorities were, and then we took that to the people who at that time held the power and the decision making, and we said, this is what we want to happen. And if it didn't, we wanted to know why, and we held people accountable, and we didn't go away. I think that's not quite what Miliband or Cameron are after, no. I suspect.
No. You're quite right there.